Fish are the last great wild harvest. On the River Tweed that winds its way through the border country, people have fished for salmon for centuries, and the hunt has shaped the lives of whole communities. In Shetland, herring were the mainstay of the local economy. Many of the islanders were also crofters and lived close to nature. Like the people of the Tweed, they have in consequence suffered greatly from the abuse of fish stocks and of the sea itself. The Tweed is a varied and versatile river, but it's known above all else for its salmon. They're the region's most famous and valuable export, and crossing whole oceans to get here, also its most romantic free import. They're irresistible magnets for fishermen.
The thing that brought me here was the salmon. The salmon was the magnet, and everything else, which actually now is rather more important, has followed on from that. Well, the Tweed, to me, is the most important salmon river in the world. It has attracted, over the years, perhaps for the last 2 centuries, some of the most famous salmon fishermen in the world. This river has produced perhaps more fish per rod in its halcyon days, 60s, as far as spring fishing is concerned, in the 20s and 30s, than perhaps most rivers.
Growing up by this epic river was a heady experience for a boy, and many dreamed of becoming gillies.
As a youngster, I used to stand on the banks of the river here and watch the men in the grey boats, and they were my heroes. That was the man I wanted to be, was the boatman. And I looked up to them so much, and they were my heroes. And I knew that one day that was my ambition, to be a gillie.
The Tweed is a real border country river, sliding imperceptibly between one country and another. The first 75 miles are in Scotland. Then, for 19 miles, it becomes the actual border. The last short stretch to Berwick is wholly in England. The river's diversity is reflected in the ways the salmon are caught. Rod and line isn't the only means. Down at Berwick and Spittal, where the river meets the sea, the local communities have for centuries caught salmon using a highly individual method known as net and cobble. And up and down the Scottish east coast, all manner of devices are wheeled out to intercept the salmon that return each year to spawn in their mother rivers. Wicker barricades, traps, and innumerable varieties of nets. Net and cobble fishing was so much a part of local tradition that in one village the vicar used to bless the nets at the start of each fishing season on the 14th of February. The service was timed to allow the first boat of the season to be launched immediately after midnight, and boats, nets and fishermen, though not the fish themselves, had benedictions called down on them. Give us, good Lord, finest nights to land our fish, sound and big to fill our wish. Keep our nets from snag and break, for every man a goodly take. Amen. In net and cobble fishing, the only legal method of netting salmon in Scottish rivers, the boat, or cobble, is rowed out in a circle from the shore, dropping the net as it goes. The other end is held by a man on the bank. Once the cobble has returned to the shore, the net is hauled in.
My father fished here, my uncles have fished here, and a lot of my forefathers fished here. And my earliest recollection would be maybe 1948, 49. I first started coming down here as a little boy, playing here, helping. We used to help with pulling the nets in, running up and down, getting things for the men, boxes and stuff like that. Some days we'll be along here soaking wet, freezing cold, miserable, tired, and as I say, what we're doing here. But all it needed was 4 or 5 fish in the net, and that was all forgotten about, and then away we'd go again.
At one time, there were more than 30 netting stations on the Tweed. The White Sands fishery was just above the Berwick Viaduct.
I was brought up on the river all my life, and you just automatically went to the net fishing when you left school. You can only look out for the salmon when there's no wind. If there's any wind or rain, you cannot see them, because they only form a little wake in the water, and that's all you have to go by. You just sit on what they called the cranks. It was a little ladder with a seat on it. And you sat down the beach there and just watch the water.
Until the mid-70s, annual catches in excess of 50,000 fish were commonplace on the Tweed. So many salmon were migrating back that even at the last netting station, a good 10 miles up from Berwick, there was still a good living to be made.
The river was low, we'd had a rain spate, and when we started there were hundreds. We had, before 1 o'clock we had 200 or 300. 3 o'clock in the afternoon we had 800. All the farm workers were fed on salmon, and one of their complaints was they were getting too many. The old farmers fishing here and feeding his workers on salmon, they were sick of the sight of it.
Far to the north, on the extreme fringes of the British Isles, lies Shetland, a labyrinth of islets divided by channels and hidden harbours. Here too, lives are inextricably linked to a culture of boats and fishing. Shetland has the tangy, independent character of all island groups, but something extra, a wild, unpredictable beauty that its natives wouldn't swap for all the balminess of the South Seas.
I seek not the place where the palm tree grows or the brilliant insect hums. Mine is the land where the north wind blows, the land where the twilight comes, where the sky is bright with the northern light when the shortening day is done, and the icy wind speeds the migrant's flight to the southland and the sun. I long not for the spicy breeze or the jungle dark and green, but give me the land where the waters freeze and the hills are brown and lean, where beneath the stars on a frosty night the pony looks shaggy and warm, and the hare is wearing his winter white in time for the first snowstorm. For there, when the spring returns once more and the streams are free to run, I can wander barefoot along the shore in the rays of the midnight sun and hear the beat of the raven's wings like distant muffled drums. Yes, mine is the land where the crowberry springs, the land where the twilight comes.
You go as far north on the mainland of Britain as you can go. The usual thing to say is I'm going from Land's End to John O'Groat, so that's only half the story, because when you get to John O'Groat, it's a big jump, 100 miles north, and you're in Shetland.
Wildlife galore. We didn't think about wildlife. This is an urban concept. There's the dichotomy between wildlife and our life, because wildlife to us was just part of the surroundings.
Shetland's colonies of gannets and auks have lived alongside the island's humans for centuries, even surviving the regular harvesting of their eggs. It was a hazardous business for the islanders as well, and the number of eggs taken seemed to make no difference to these vast bird cities. Most of the island's other wild creatures have rubbed along with the locals too. They're looked on as agreeable and useful citizens, and indicators of how the seasons are shaping up. They give clues about weather changes and approaching fish shoals, and about the state of the environment that Shetlanders of all species have to share.
We think it's quite a nice place, and we think it's quite picturesque, but maybe other people wouldn't think that. We're very exposed to the weather. We don't have very nice weather. We have quite a lot of gales, rain, and it can be pretty cold, although sometimes we do get a nice sunny day, but I'm afraid this year we haven't had very many.
The wind can be stupendous here. Force 8 gales or worse on an average of 3 or 4 days each month. They can drive tides vertically up the cliffs, and streaming across the flat land, they can make tree growth all but impossible.
the sea is awesome. The sea is awesome. And it is so many moods. Goes hand in hand with Mother Earth for me. But you have to stand in awe of it. You have to appreciate it can be a very dangerous thing as well as a very good friend.
The weather and the constant blurring between land and sea produce a special kind of kinship between humans and wildlife. I reckon Shetlanders are halfway to being amphibious themselves.
From Samborough Head, the mainland stretches northward in a long, narrow strip in which is some of the best farming land of the islands. The valleys and hillsides are dotted with numberless small crofts, which are the sheet anchor of Shetland life. But it is in the sheltered bays along the coast there can be found the key to Shetland prosperity. For like his Norse ancestors, the Shetlander is a seafaring man before all else, and fishing is the staple industry of the island.
It started off with driftnet fishing, and that's a type of fishing that's been practiced for many, many years. It was practiced before the war, and at the back of the war then it was started up again. It was temporarily stopped during the war or run down anyway, very few boats. And since the war it's built up a fairly large fleet.
Lerwick's main claim to importance is as a herring fishing centre, of which it is the largest on the British Isles. The season is only a short one and is practically restricted to the month of June.
Well, I have a nostalgic feeling about the driftnet boats particularly, and a whole lot of Shetlanders did, because the atmosphere created by the driftnetters was different from any other type of fishing. Well, in the summer months when it all happened, Lerwick population would be double. And I met somebody quite recently who said that when she heard the tune South of the Border that was popular just before the last war, then she said she could just see the scene at the herring stations, and she could hear the coopers hammering their barrels and hear the banter of young people all together. And somehow we thought it would never end.
Oh, they were great days. Lerwick and in the country places too, because there were herring stations dotted all around Shetland. But in Lerwick, all the way along the harbour, everything was just alive. There were, the freshers would come, the barrel boats would come, the salt boats, and you could almost walk the Bressie on the drifters before they put to sea. There were so many in. And then following the fleet, of course, there would be fisher girls from the Western Isles and Ireland and down in Scotland, and the street vendors and the street musicians.
Older men looked for signs of herring. That was a different thing. There was no meters then, no sonars, nothing, no electronics of any kind. A wheelers then was just a compass and a wheel to steer by, and that was all there was. But well, there were several signs they looked for. They looked for grease on the water, the colour of the water, the direction of wind for different places, different tides and all that. It was just experience, I suppose.
At last the skipper decides to shoot the nets. Maybe the herring are here, maybe another 10 miles out.
The River Tweed didn't become famous solely for its fishing. It also provided the power for a thriving woolen industry that enabled towns such as Galashiels, Hawick and Selkirk to grow up along the banks of the Tweed and its tributaries.
There was a buzz, a sort of throbbing in the town, because all the mills were working all the time and they throbbed, and your life was ruled by the factory whistles. Morning, lunchtime, tea time, they sounded whistles, and the streets were full of people. It was the Tweed mills that certainly brought the railways, and they brought the roads, and they brought money into the borders. All those wonderful big mansions that you see were all built by border mill magnates. And they brought in French architects and Italian plasterers, and the money that there must have been in this part of the world was amazing.
The Shetland Islands were also famous for wool production, but on a much smaller scale.
Shetland wool was reckoned to be the finest in the world. It was very, very fine, and when it was spun, the finest thread you could spin, you could knit a shawl out of it and draw that shawl through a wedding ring.
The tough island sheep used to spend the summer up on the hills and come down into the croft pasture lands in winter, to the benefit of almost everything that lived in both habitats. But these days, Shetland is switching to heavier carcass, crossbred sheep, which can't survive on the rough hill grazing. And for the first time, all the dubious benefits of modern pasture management, artificial fertilizers and weed killers, are beginning to arrive on the islands.
Rowan is a Shetland word for, nowadays it's called shearing, but rowing is plucking the wool off the sheep. Usually they tied the sheep's feet, 2 feet and 2 feet. They tied them together with a rope, and then you just sat down with the sheep, or lay on your knees with the sheep on the ground, and you plucked the wool off. And you see, the new fleece rises, and it pushes up the old fleece, and there's a visible separation when you look at them. You can see there's a separation. When you pull that wool, the old fleece pulls off and it leaves the new one. Some sheep, it would be much tougher than others, and therefore if you had sheep that the wool was clinging very firmly to and were very tough, and you had to row a whole day, you'd find it's probably painful on the sheep, but it's painful on the fingers too, because you'd get your fingers blistered by evening. But anyway, nowadays there's not many folks doing that. They're mostly all using either sheep shears or else electric shears.
To understand the changes that have taken place in the borders, you need to take a look back in time. Its early history was anything but peaceful. The Tweed proved no obstacle to the English, who made repeated looting raids between the 13th and 17th centuries. And they weren't the only troublemakers. Until pacified by James II, the border bandits known as reivers or moss troopers fought out their own feuds on both sides of the Tweed.
We suffered both ways in the olden days because the English armies raiding up through gave us a hammering, and the Scots armies raiding back gave us a hammering, so we got it from both sides. We are independent people in the middle. We're not really Scots, we're not English, we're borderers.
The countryside is littered with reminders of this turbulent past, which may help explain why many borderers still talk of ancient battles as if they happened only yesterday. There are other legacies of various monarchs' ploys to secure the allegiance of the reivers.
If a particular person did a good job of work for the king, he would be given lands free as a recompense for what he had done. And in this way it all built up, and various lords and dukes and earls and so on spread throughout the border country.
There seems to be more dukes per square mile in the borders than there are almost anywhere. But it's a very good thing from the point of view of getting continuity, because they all have their estates which are beautifully managed and run, which from the point of view of good country management, and you could hardly find better examples anywhere.
But the pervasive influence of the big estates in the borders generated habits of deference and almost feudal attitudes towards social position that still linger today.
Well, you say there was the social setup of the countryside. You had the laird, we owned the land. We was almost all powerful, almost still is, and he lets the farms out to tenants, and the tenants employ farm workers, although the farm workers are a rarity now. And then, of course, in the farmers, there was the two grades of farmers. There was a gentleman farmer and the working farmer. There don't have no nonsense working farmer. The gentleman farmer, well, the definition of a gentleman farmer is a man who is neither.
At the very bottom of the social pyramid were the bondages, female farm labourers who were hired under terms resembling indentured slavery. Their clothing was unmistakable, something like the loose, assertive costumes of southern French peasants.
The bondages were tied female farm labourers, and they had to take out a contract of a year, and they really couldn't leave in a year. And it was a way of getting extra labour on farms. Very, very ancient system. Nobody knows when it started. And it only really ended at just about the Second World War. They were paid about half of a man's wage, and the pay was paid by the man they worked for, not the farmer. So it was really a form of sort of indentured slavery. They did terribly heavy work. And one old woman told me, she was frail and tiny, and she told me that she was set to carrying sacks of corn on her back, and the sacks of corn weighed more than she did, up a ladder into the hayloft. And that was her first job.
The fact that only this bit of their face was exposed, they were stunned with the sun, just an oval there, and at the dances, the local dances, you could tell at a glance, the servant lasses, the domestic servants, for the bondagers, because the domestic servants were milk white, and the bondagers had this brown bit on their faces.
Some of the bondagers had very hard lives. There are records of some farmers, if their horse was sick, putting bondages between the shafts and making the bondagers pull the plough.
Well, these women, there were 6 or 7 of them, big, strong women, hardened with hard work. Their life was dull. They liked to laugh, and if you didn't behave yourself and work well, they would just down you and sit down on you and pull your trousers off and throw them away. And mind, if you were grown up with your shirt as most laddies were, it was a most humiliating experience.
Slightly higher up the social scale were the local people employed to work in the grounds of the big estates. In the pre-mechanised age, there seemed to be work for everybody.
When I started working here 35 years ago, there were 2 men who did absolutely nothing except wander around the paths, trimming any branch that looked as if it might fall or looked a bit sickly. And another 2 men who did nothing but ditches and hedging. The only absolute fact on numbers I've got is that in 1913 there were 13 men within the walled garden, which is under 2 acres. Every inch of hedge was cut with a hedging knife. Every inch of ditch was dug with a ditching spade.
The tidy hierarchies continued inside the house, through layers of undermaids, housemaids, cooks and butlers.
When you're on estate, when you came of age to work, the girls usually went into either be seamstresses or into the kitchens or into doing table maid or housemaid, and the boys went onto the estate. They either went into the forestry or went into the garden or into the stables. You see, you were all employed, the whole family was employed.
Even my grandparents had a butler and a cook and a lady's maid, pantry maid, several housemaids.
Well, you're a privileged person to be on the estate. You never, as I said, you never went hungry, and you always had clothes. You were always looked after. You weren't just nobody, you were somebody.
The fishing parties held by the riparian owners were the major social occasions of the Borders countryside. They involved all the river and household staff and made demands on their loyalty and confidentiality that would be unthinkable today.
By 8 o'clock, 8:45, the gentlemen would start arriving in their big cars, and then we'd have to get them all stripped out and into their weeders and things. It wasn't just a fishing, it was a complete day out for them. They came into the fishing and they just sat down and they just talked and talked about everything that was on their mind. And they talked about what women had been sleeping with the night before. They talked about what stocks and shares they had doing, what was good and what wasn't good. And Father just had to listen to it, went in one ear and out of another. That's what you did in private service. There was loyalty. There was loyalty. You heard things, you saw things, and you kept it to yourself. You never said nothing. And then in the afternoon when they were fishing, the ladies would arrive, and then Mother would have to get tea ready for them. Sometimes they went walking to see what the men was catching. Other times you sat and had a good old natter between themselves. They would talk about, oh, what bridge party they were at, and what garden party they were going to, and what ball they had been at, and who was the best milliner to go to, and who was the best hairdresser to get their hair, all this sort of thing, just all women's talk.
There was no room for a social hierarchy in the Shetlands, where the harsh conditions have always demanded that people pull together as equals. Each self-sufficient croft would have its own patch of cultivated land, a peat lot for fuel, and pasture for dairy cattle. And to provide feed for the cattle in winter, there'd be an enclosed hay meadow, full of wildflowers and breeding birds. Often the crofts were worked by women, while the men were away on that other Shetland livelihood, harvesting the sea.
The gunner signals by hand to the mate of the wheel. Course and speed are constantly altered to match the whale's maneuvers. For an old and experienced whale knows well the meaning of the throb from the ship's propeller. Balancing himself on the slippery foredeck, the gunner takes aim. The whole vessel shakes with the recoil of the gun.
We don't kill them now, but they did in Shetland just as much as in Faroe at one time. Again, it wasn't down for sport, it was a commercial whaling. They were killed for their oil, which was always a very sellable commodity.
There was two or three whaling stations in Shetland. But a lot of the Shetlanders and Walser men went to the whale fishing in the Antarctic in the years following the war.
You left here about August, September, October, and then you joined your ships probably in Shields or Leith or wherever, Liverpool or wherever, and you sailed for the Antarctic. And you would be away all winter. It'd probably be next year in June before you got back here again. At that time I was young and my parents looked after the craft, my mother and father. But a lot of the men, those left behind was the wives and children. They left their wives and children in the craft. But they were usually extended family. They would have other sisters or parents of that who would help and assist them when the husband was away down the range.
I remember being hounded out of bed at daybreak before I went to school and sent off down to the rocks with a rod and a basket or a kishie to catch the fish that would be our meal when we come back home from school. My grandfather was quite interested in all that went on around him. That included the birds and animals that he had to live with on the croft. And I think that rubbed off on me more than perhaps anybody else. First time I saw an otter was on the shores, just below the croft. As usual, I was playing on the shore. I always headed for the shores whenever I escaped from parental control. And I was well used with cats on the shore too, because cats visited the shore from time to time, because cats like fish and they follow fishermen. And our own cat used to follow my grandfather when he went fishing for saithe off the rocks. And he would always give her the first fish or two, and she'd eat what she could, and then she'd take one in her mouth and head for home. So I was playing on the shore, and I saw what I thought was a cat. Suddenly noticed it on a rock, eating a fish. I thought, well, funny, I hadn't seen that cat before. And I said, puss, puss, or some such term. And to my horror, instead of coming towards him with its tail up in the air, it dived into the sea and disappeared. I was quite put out by this, because I thought it would definitely drown. And when later on, when I told the story to my parents, they laughed at me and said, well, what I'd seen was an otter. Any animal that can be used was used when you had to, and otters were no exception. In fact, an otter's skin was worth a week's wage to a crofter, so otters were certainly hunted, and nearly every district had its otter hunter, a man who specialised in taking otters as part of his living.
An otter skin properly processed was a valuable commodity. You would get as much for that as you would get for a week's work. And a balanced otter, and the human being struck a balance whereby the otter was never at any risk of extinction or anything. He's too fly-a-lead for that. And the local crofter, he would have been the first person to draw back. If the otter or the seal was in danger of extinction, he knew where he was well off.
And otters, when I was a boy, were still living under that sort of pressures. So they were not so easy to see as they are now. Well, now, since about 1970, 20, 30 years, otters have not been hunted, and they've reacted by becoming much more tolerant of man's behaviour towards them, which is much less aggressive than it used to be. So that it's no uncommon thing to see otters out of doors in broad daylight now, feeding along the shores in the way that they probably always had done before man came on the scene. For many years, otters almost became nocturnal, as they are in many parts of the south.
Shetland otters live blissful lives compared to their cousins further south. Their numbers have risen to more than 1,000 over the last decade, and they hunt in broad daylight now. They've become as adaptable as foxes, nosing about in boats and outbuildings on the foreshore. Their improving status is an indication of the congenial landscape produced by crofting, a way of life that made the most of this sour land and supported an intricate environment full of variety. But the insular life of the borderers could not last forever. After the Second World War, mechanised farming invaded the redoubts of the Tweed Valley, just as it did every other corner of rural Britain. And heavy post-war taxation put the large estates under increasing pressure to reduce their staff.
The worst day in my family's life, I think, was when we had to take a decision to cut down on our farming and forestry staff. In fact, the whole estate staff had to be cut down on. It just was not being a viable estate. And if we hadn't taken drastic action, then everybody would have lost their jobs. We now run the house, which admittedly we did reduce in 1958, but we now run it with two part-timers and ourselves.
The tradition of salmon fishing as the centrepiece of those leisurely house parties began to disappear too. The letting of fishing rights to business syndicates was too good a source of income for the struggling estates to ignore.
Sadly, like most things in life, it has become very commercial, and this beach was kept really for the enjoyment of the family, and that was about it. We now have it for 4 weeks of the season, and otherwise it is let to tenants paying fairly considerable sums of money for it.
It became a commercial business, whereas, you know, sort of before the war, it was the riparian owners that fished the rivers, you know, and they fished it alone with their, obviously with their friends. And after the war, it became commercialised, and it's now, you know, it is big business, salmon fishing, serious big business. And I think maybe possibly some of the traditions went out of it. Certainly not in my case, because I wallow in the traditions of salmon fishing.
They're not ladies and gentlemen any longer. They're completely changed. That was ladies and gentlemen in olden days, but not now. They're just middle-class people now, I'm afraid to say.
In the end, the borderers' ancient habit of deference was their own worst enemy. Stuck in their stations on the social hierarchy, they were buffeted by the social and ecological changes sweeping through the Tweed Valley. Even the salmon themselves, the seemingly inexhaustible currency which underpinned the whole economy, began to decline. Returning to spawn across thousands of miles of ocean, they brought the crises of the sea right home to the borders. The Tweed salmon had to swim through deep-sea drift nets and an area of the North Sea that's become one of the most polluted waters on the planet. fewer and fewer of them made it.
And now, with the light at the masthead and the nets trailing out, the boats drift with the tide. About 1 a.m., the skipper decides to haul the nets. With about 50 cran on board, 9 tons of herring. The old traditional craft and wisdom and luck have filled the hull. Now it's full steam ahead for the market.
Drift netting went on till about the early 1960s, when a fleet of purse net boats appeared from the eastward, a Viking invasion as it were.
Yes, it was very dramatic actually, because it was almost overnight that it happened, without warning actually. And the first that I heard about it was earwigging again on the marine band, because the fishermen used to call in their homes. It was all very different then, and they didn't mind giving their positions or anything. And they called their homes to say how many crans they'd had. And I came in on a couple of skippers, and something really dramatic had happened. One could tell, but they couldn't get a gist of what it was. But before long it emerged that 200 Scandinavian purse netters had arrived unexpected on the grounds. That's just on the territorial limit, you see, to the east of Shetland. Now, if they were ordinary boats, it was quite dramatic. But what they were new boats. They were about 100 feet, which is about twice the length of the fleets here, you see, fishing the herring, were all the way down to Yarmouth. I mean, it wasn't just Shetlanders. And so they were big boats. And they had this Aztec, as they called it then, it's the sonar, I understand. So they weren't restricted to the darkness and having to fool the herring and put your wits against the herring. They could fish all the day round. And then they had this huge nets. I mean, it was lifted by hydraulic block, and nobody had ever seen that before. Because the worst of the herring fishing was the hard work hauling the wet nets. And it was just dramatic in every way. And they proceeded to give the British herringmen an absolute lesson in how to catch herring. And it was estimated at the end of this, Shetland was agog about this, of course, and it was estimated at the end of the season that the Scandinavian purse netters had caught nearly 200,000 tons, while the British contingent had caught 10,000. So you see, it was just the beginning of the total end of drift netting.
And not just the end of drift netting, but the end almost of the herring itself. Its stocks were so depleted that for 6 years there was a ban on netting. Old Shetland institutions were devastated, from the sand eels on which so many of the bird colonies depended, to the skills and knowledge which generations of fishermen had developed. The trawlers sucked up the whole ecosystem. And on the Tweed, the salmon were not only overfished, but starting in 1967, were hit again, cruelly and ironically, by a purely natural disaster, a mysterious disease called ulcerative dermal necrosis, or UDN.
We didn't know what was really happening to salmon. They came in with a little dab in their nose, a little blemish, which we just took a knife and scraped it off, or maybe give them a little polish. And they went to the market fine, but gradually it got worse and worse. The great white fungus started. Eventually we ended up burying them across on the island there. We dug a big hole every morning. It was heartbreaking. Chucked them in the hole, put some quicklime on it, which the bailiff supplied, and buried all the catch. Went away home disappointed.
At its peak, UDN killed over 13,000 prime salmon in the Tweed. It burned itself out eventually, but remains a perplexing disease. It's no wonder that with so many unmanageable threats to the salmon, the borderers began to look for scapegoats.
There are more and more of them on the river, and the fisher people reckon that they eat all the salmon. I would just be a boy, about maybe 9, 10 maybe, and above the stone bridge itself there was a place they called Malshoe, and we used to go up there and swim, and it was up one day over in the swim in the sun and looking for birds' nests, and this big white duck. Never seen a thing like this before in my life. It was something completely new. It took a little while before I discovered it, and this was a male goosander, and that was the first I'd ever seen. I never knew there were such things as goosanders to then. Now we see them fairly frequently.
Well, the goosander is a fairly specific feeder. It feeds on fish of a certain size. If you count out the number of smoked and small trout that actually go into their daily diet, it works out a substantial number. Goosanders on Tweed were always shot from the time they first started coming over from the Scandinavian countries. They were kept well controlled up until the Wildlife and Countryside Act. But since then, the only time that they're controlled is a small annual cull every spring by the Tweed bailiffs.
Goosanders first nested in northern Scotland in 1871 and have since spread steadily south. There are now around 9,000 in the UK, with an average of 750 birds in the Tweed area in recent winters. They can eat large numbers of small salmon, but consume even more eels, which are the major predator of the salmon fry, and no evidence that goosander predation makes any impact on salmon numbers has ever been produced. Despite this, well over 3,000 birds have been culled under licence in the Tweed area in the last 10 years. The true causes of the salmon decline lie out at sea, but its effects are felt inland. In the Shetlands, whales have sometimes paid the price for competing with man for fish.
There was whales around then, small whale, and I don't know really what type of whale it was. We called it a herring hog.
Herring hog is a monkey whale, and they seem to be very interested in the herring shows. And that's one of the sights that the fishermen used to watch for when they were setting nets. They wanted to see the fulmar, and they wanted to see a nice green colour, the plankton, of course, you see. And they wanted to see a couple of herring hogs in the area. They watched everything, of course, the gannets dive, and they knew the traditional places to expect to find herring. They wanted to see all the signs too before they would set a net.
After the war, the Norwegians were fairly active with the fishing of that whale, and we didn't like to see them, but they did come around and would lie beside us when we were lying at the nets, wait till we started to haul, and with the herring coming out of the nets, the whale was always, not always, but sometimes round, eating that herring, and of course they shot them.
Because of the dramatic reduction in salmon entering Tweed that we've noticed over the last 30 years, we're now very, very worried indeed about the stocks of fish in the river. It's a tragic situation. So now, those of us who fish Tweed regularly, we're in the habit of returning certainly all red fish, that is, fish that have been in the river a few weeks or longer, are returned. Regardless of size.
Yet the drastic decline in the numbers of fish returning to the Tweed has affected the rod fishermen much less than the netsmen. It is hard market economics. A single salmon caught by rod and line brings in £500 in licence fees, hotel charges and the like. A £6 netted fish earns at most £40. With farm salmon now widely available, it's easy to understand why the family fisheries have been bought out by a body called the Atlantic Salmon Trust acting in the name of conservation.
I haven't a clue who the Atlantic Trust were or what they were, or what they do, anything. But the only thing I knew was that they were taking over the fishery and we had 3 years to go. One of the recollections I had about the last day was my cousin Tom Hall standing at the doorway of the shield with a tear in his eye, and when he come down the stairs, you know, we spoke, said, "Tom, are you okay?" He says, "I've just been standing up there thinking this was my grandfather's, and then it was my father's, then it was mine, and now I've got 2 sons to take over this, and they'll never ever get the chance to take over."
They always said we hadn't blood in our veins, that it was Tweed water. Of course, our forefathers was fishermen, and we were really just brought up to the way of life.
Shetlanders were also having to adapt to some dramatic changes.
Certainly we never expected to see the oil terminal when I was a young boy, but it sort of just fits into the place, and no, we never see it.
There's very, very little pollution so far now for several years. It's very clean. I mean, otters live around the terminal, live around the wharfs and all that sort of thing.
They found that they were actually living in their stonework around the jetties over there, right in the terminal there. They pay no attention. In fact, they've got a sign up on the road saying "Otters crossing, beware," so the motorists coming in. Yes, so they're living all around the terminal. They're quite at home.
Well, oil has certainly changed things, there's no doubt about that. It's given the local authority more money than they'd ever had before. And by and large, they've used that money very wisely. It's made more jobs.
I mean, oil has been good. It's provided a range of technical jobs that were badly needed in Shetland. And so that a lot of the university graduates and technically qualified Shetlanders have been able to work in Shetland if that's what they wanted to do, and that's been great. I mean, obviously it created social change fairly rapidly, but it was change that was going to happen anyhow.
At one time, you know, when you went to do your shopping into Myrtle Street, if you met a stranger, it was news. But when the oil began to come here, if you met somebody you knew, it was news. No, it was an awful upheaval, but things are beginning to settle down now.
I mean, when the oil boom came, and at one point there were about 50% of the children in the high school were new to Shetland. And people started talking about the Shetland way of life and the Shetland dialect disappearing, and the opposite happened.
50 years ago, if you wanted to insult a Shetlander, you called him a Scotsman. He didn't like to be called that. But now that's all gone. We don't pay any attention now. We've got English, Scotch, Irish, Welsh, all living around. Nobody pays any attention. As long as he's a good neighbour, he's all right.
Some people are very proud to say that they're Scottish, and others that they're mostly Norse. Personally speaking, I feel that I really must have quite a few roots that go back into Scotland, and I just like to think I'm a Shetlander.
I'm not Scottish. I'm Shetland. I live right the other side of the Tartan Curtain, way up north of the Tartan Curtain. I have nothing. That's not meaning that I have anything against Scotsmen. I just am not white. It's the same as calling a Welshman English. You're liable to get a fistful of Welsh knuckles if you did. But it's not putting on the style. It's a historical fact. I'm just not Scottish. I don't blow bagpipes nor wear kilts or anything, even Scottish culture. We've a different culture. We've our own.
Shetlanders' roots are Norse as much as Scottish. They come from strong communities, wise in the use of the sea, and haven't been vulgarised by their newfound wealth. Their handling of the impact of oil on their lives and on the local ecology has been a lesson we can all learn from. Let's hope that Shetland's furious gales have indeed dispersed the worst of the spills, and that a more insidious legacy is not lying on the ocean floor, waiting, like a creature from Norse mythology, to exact its revenge. There was something tragically inevitable about the disappearance of the Tweed netsman's centuries-old way of life. When a sought-after natural resource becomes scarce, it begins to acquire a monetary value far beyond what is justified by its utility. In the end, its value is as a trophy, and it becomes a commodity in the leisure business, not the food industry. This may be good for the conservation of the salmon, but it can seem rough justice to the people who relied on it for their livelihoods. Naturalists talk a good deal these days about indicator species, creatures whose fortunes register changes in the environment. The fate of the Tweed salmon, like the herring in Shetland, has certainly told us a lot about overfishing and the degradation of the seas. It's also shown some of the harsher realities behind the relentless evolution of the countryside into a playground.